Hey friends, welcome back. We live in a culture obsessed with what's new. New ideas, new technology, new movements, new trends, new ways of thinking. Even within Christianity, we're constantly being introduced to some new approach that's supposed to transform our faith. But here's a question we don't ask nearly as often as we ought. Is it true? Because something can be new without being good, and something can be old without being outdated. In letter 25 of the Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis exposes another subtle strategy of the enemy. Screwtape wants us so fascinated by what's new that eventually we become embarrassed by what's permanent. And once that happens, we stop asking whether an idea is true or false, right or wrong, wise or foolish, and begin asking whether it's modern. Let's get into it. Screwtape begins this letter concerned about the group of Christians surrounding the patient. The problem? They're simply Christian. And he doesn't like that. He wants Christianity to become Christianity and the latest political movement, Christianity and the latest psychology, Christianity and the latest social cause, Christianity and the latest health movement, Christianity and whatever happens to be fashionable at the moment. Now, Lewis isn't necessarily saying that Christians shouldn't care about politics, psychology, medicine, education, culture, or social issues. Of course we should. The danger comes when something else becomes so attached to our Christianity that eventually we can't distinguish between the gospel and the thing we've attached to it. Instead of allowing Christianity to shape how we understand everything else, we allow everything else to reshape Christianity. And eventually, the adjective becomes more important than the noun. We're no longer simply Christians. We have to be a particular kind of Christian. And Screwtape loves that, because if he can't remove Christianity from our lives, he'll happily settle for adding enough things to it that Christianity itself disappears beneath them. Screwtape calls the next temptation the horror of the same old thing. Humans live in time. We experience reality one moment after another. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. And because of that, Lewis says we naturally enjoy change. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, God created us that way. God made change pleasurable. But Lewis pointed out something beautiful. God didn't give us only change. He also gave us permanence. Think about the seasons. Spring is different from winter. Summer is different from spring. Autumn is different from summer. There is constant change, and yet every year the seasons return. Lewis calls this union of change and permanence rhythm. Christmas comes every year, but somehow it can still feel special. Spring returns every year, but the first warm day can still feel new. The sun rises every morning, and yet a beautiful sunrise can still stop us in our tracks. God satisfies our desire for novelty without requiring us to abandon what is permanent. That's his design. Rhythm. Change without chaos. Permanence without stagnation. The enemy takes that natural enjoyment of change and exaggerates it. Instead of enjoying something new, we begin demanding something new. And those are very different things. Lewis says hell wants to turn our healthy enjoyment of novelty into a craving for absolute novelty. We don't simply enjoy change anymore, we need it. The next experience, the next purchase, the next trend, the next relationship, the next outrage, the next piece of entertainment, the next thing that will finally make life interesting again. And Lewis makes a fascinating observation. The more novelty we consume, the less satisfying novelty becomes. Desire increases, while pleasure decreases. Think about how relevant that is today. We can consume more entertainment in one evening than previous generations could have imagined. We can scroll through hundreds of videos in an hour, every few seconds something new, something different, something designed to capture our attention. And yet, are we becoming more satisfied, or simply harder to satisfy? That's exactly the trap Screwtape describes. Novelty promises satisfaction, while quietly training us to become more and more dissatisfied with everything we already have. And eventually, Lewis says the demand for novelty becomes dangerous, because there's only so much innocent novelty available. Eventually, if the craving continues growing, we begin searching outside the boundaries God has established. Something has to become more shocking, more extreme, more provocative, more indulgent. What once satisfied us becomes boring, so we need something stronger. Lewis uses the arts as an example. An artist creates something beautiful, but eventually the audience says, "We've seen that before." So beautiful is no longer enough. It has to be different. Then provocative, then shocking, then transgressive. And eventually breaking the boundary itself becomes confused with creativity. Something sexually explicit can be praised because it's provocative. Something grotesque can be praised because it's daring. Something irrational can be praised simply because it's unconventional. The question is no longer, is it beautiful, is it good, or is it true? The question becomes, is it new? And that's Lewis's warning. Once novelty becomes the standard, eventually God's boundaries begin to look like obstacles to creativity rather than protections against sin. But his principle reaches much further. When novelty becomes an idol, eventually different becomes more important than good. And once that happens, God's boundaries begin to look boring. Restraint looks outdated, faithfulness looks dull, tradition looks oppressive, and sin begins to look exciting. The enemy has taken a perfectly innocent human pleasure, our enjoyment of change, and turned it into dissatisfaction with God's design. Then Lewis makes one of my favorite observations in this entire letter. Screwtape explains why hell loves fashions. Not merely fashion in clothing, but fashions in thought. Every generation has fashionable ideas, fashionable virtues, fashionable fears, fashionable sins, and hell uses them to distract us from the sins we're actually committing. Lewis basically says the enemy wants people running around with fire extinguishers whenever there's a flood, and rushing to the side of the boat that's already nearly underwater. In other words, keep people worried about the danger their generation is least likely to fall into. If a society is cruel, make everyone terrified of being overly sentimental. If a society is sexually permissive, make everyone terrified of being prudish. If a society is cowardly, make everyone terrified of aggression. If a society is arrogant, make everyone terrified of low self-esteem. The point is not that the opposite danger isn't real. The point is Satan would love for us to spend all our energy fighting yesterday's sins, while today's sins walk through the front door. And that requires discernment. We shouldn't merely ask, what sins did my grandparents struggle with? We should also ask, what sins does my generation celebrate? Because the sins we're least likely to recognize are often the ones our culture has renamed as virtues. Finally, Screwtape reveals what he considers the greatest victory of all. Get humans to stop asking whether something is true and get them asking whether it's progressive. Is this on the right side of history? Is this where society is going? Is this modern? Is this outdated? Lewis points out the absurdity of this. We don't know where history is going. The future isn't a destination that exists independently of all human choices. The future is being created, in part, by the choices people make right now. So instead of asking, is this where history is going, Lewis says we should be asking much simpler questions. Is it right? Is it prudent? Is it possible? Is it coherent with Scripture as a whole? Those questions force us to deal with reality. But words like progressive, modern, reactionary, outdated, and even the future can become ways of avoiding the real argument by applying biased stigma. Calling an idea progressive doesn't prove it's good. Calling an idea outdated doesn't prove it's wrong. Truth doesn't have an expiration date, and falsehood doesn't become truth simply because enough people support it or because enough time has passed. I think this is where letter 25 becomes incredibly important for Christians today. Our faith is rooted in truths that do not change simply because the culture does. God doesn't need to be updated. Scripture doesn't become false because society finds it unfashionable. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. That doesn't mean Christians should fear everything new. Lewis is not arguing that. Remember, God created change. God created novelty. God created seasons. There's nothing inherently holy about something being old, and there's nothing inherently sinful about something being new. The question is whether we have the wisdom to distinguish change from progress, because they're not the same thing. Sometimes change moves us forward. Sometimes change moves us backward. And sometimes change simply moves us somewhere else. The Christian's responsibility isn't to worship the past or chase the future. It's to remain faithful in the present. Letter 25 reminds us that the enemy doesn't always need to convince us that Christianity is false. Sometimes he only needs to convince us that it's old. Make obedience seem outdated. Make holiness seem boring. Make restraint seem primitive. Make the newest idea seem automatically superior to the old one. And eventually we stop asking whether something is true. We simply ask whether it's fashionable. So the question Lewis leaves us with isn't, is this new or is this old? But is this true? Is this right? Is this wise? Because truth isn't determined by fashion, and God isn't waiting for the world to catch him up with the times. Next week, we'll be looking into the 26th letter, where Screwtape reveals how the enemy can twist something as seemingly virtuous as unselfishness until two people are both sacrificing for each other, while somehow each becomes convinced that the other is selfish. And hey, if you found this insightful, helpful, or even convicting, please like it and share it with someone that might feel the same. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next week.